Okay, well, welcome everybody. So this is a panel on COVID-19 and mobile systems. So welcome to the panel. We have 4 people on the panel, including myself, but I'm mainly going to moderate. So I'm Landon Cox, I'm from Microsoft Research. The other panelists are Dinesh Bharadia from UC San Diego, Gollakota from University of Washington, and Daniyal Liaqat from University of Toronto. And so the title of the panel should give you an indication of what we're going to talk about. The reason that we're doing this virtually is because of this horrible pandemic. And you've probably spent some time the last few months thinking about how mobile systems might be useful for addressing the challenges that we are facing. And so there are a lot of ways in which you can imagine that mobile systems, both from the past and also hopefully in the future, could be useful. And so some of the ways that you've probably either heard or thought about how mobile systems could be helpful are things like exposure notifications and contact tracing. So you've probably heard about the Apple Google initiative, as well as deployments in places like Singapore, of using mobile systems to understand interactions between people. You could also imagine using mobile systems to do proximity sensing and tracking between people to make sure that people are keeping a safe distance. I've seen people describe mobile systems that do symptom sensing and tracking. So if you're developing symptoms using mobile systems to detect that. And then similarly to detect when an environment is unsafe. Are there too many people within an indoor environment? Are people wearing masks or not? And I'm probably missing other ways in which mobile systems could help address the pandemic. And so that's what this panel is going to be about. So the format of the panel is that each of the panelists is going to give a short 10-minute presentation on both the problems that they think are interesting, maybe some work that they've already started. At the end of that, we'll open it up for Q&A. If there are questions from the audience, we'll start with those. But I have some questions that I'd be happy to ask as well. So with that, I'm going to hand over the screen to Shyam, and he'll have 10 minutes to tell you about some of the work that he's been doing.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Gollakota from University of Washington, and I will be talking about some of the tech solutions for COVID-19. I wanted to start by quoting Trevor Bedford, who was one of the first researchers who identified that community spreading was happening in the United States, in particular in Seattle. And he said that the effort to combat COVID-19 is very likely going to be the Apollo program of our times. I very much agree with him, but at the same time, I also think that tech cannot really solve COVID-19. We cannot really use computers to create drugs by themselves. We need people who are going and testing these drugs. We can't really throw machine learning at this problem because we don't have a huge amount of data yet. Similarly, tech cannot also replace manual contact tracers. It's potentially the only thing we could do, or one of the few things we could do, is help make the job of frontline workers a little bit easier. And the analogy which I typically like to give is similar to a typewriter versus a Word document or a paint. It's not creating art, but it's enabling artists to do their artists or people who edit things to do their job a little bit faster and more efficiently. So with that goal in mind, we have been working since March with a pretty big team of people at UW, at UPenn, Boston Public Health Commission, and a pretty big set of folks at Microsoft, volunteers and Microsoft researchers, including Landon over here. And this includes experts across security, privacy, mobile systems, and more importantly, public health. And that's because that's the most important thing which we need to understand to see what we can actually do to make their lives a little bit easier. So we designed this app back in March of last year, April of this year, sorry. Things fly by really fast, called COVID Safe. And the goal here is basically to make the life of public health officials easier And basically to ensure that when someone is detected positive or when they're being detected positive, people call the Department of Health in your own state or your own county. If you're in California, it's a per county. They're going to call and they're going to try to figure out, they're going to do a whole contact tracing interview to figure out who you have potentially come in contact with, where you have been. And this is part of the normal process of manual contact tracing. This is allowed by law, and this is exactly what they have the authority to do when there is a disease like this. So the challenge which we were told is that when this kind of an interview process happens, they had to deal with a lot of issues, including the fact that the person had just been notified a few days or the same day that they have been tested positive. So they're not in the same space to basically answer all those questions. And even the whole interview itself takes about 30 to 45 minutes, or actually even more, because it requires people to enter a variety of different questions. There's a whole interview they need to enter. There's a whole forms they need to answer questions over the phone. So one of the things which we created is took the questions they're answering, and we create a mobile platform as well as a web platform to answer these questions on their phone itself. And more importantly, think of it as like a memory aid tool. Imagine if I asked you, where have you been 2 days back or 3 days back? It's really challenging for me to remember what's actually happening. And if I had to remember that when I've been tested positive, that's even more challenging. So this app basically allows it to go through Google services, Google location services, and look at the locations and identify the locations. It's not going to share these locations with the public health officials. It's just going to display it to the user while they are doing the interview, so that it will help them aid in terms of explaining where they have been to the public health officials. It also has an ability to basically say that I basically met my friend, and what is the phone number? And this information is pretty challenging to give on the phone because people have accents and so on. And so we have an ability to basically enter their contact information. And one of the other things which is essential is accessibility. So this app is now, we're going to be designing it in 10 of the most commonly spoken languages in Washington state. So these are some of the important things which particular app does. And all these things, there's a large number of different consents which have to be given for any of this information to even leave the phone. And the user has to basically be informed about it. And the user is the one who is basically giving the consent about sending any of this information to the public health official, not to the cloud, but the public health official who is on the phone with them. It also supports exposure notification. You'd have heard a lot about this from Google and Apple. We implemented a version of it before Google and Apple things came out, and since then we are one of the few apps in the United States Google and Apple is working with to integrate their APIs with using Bluetooth. And this is a pretty novel system from a public health official. From us, we know all the limitations of Bluetooth, the fact that Bluetooth on phones don't really give you phase information, and almost a variety of different localization algorithms we have today requires people to hop across all the 48 frequencies, and that's not really possible when you're trying to do these things. And also we don't have phase information, or we don't have multiple antennas. So it's pretty clear on the conversations with a variety of parties that we have to live with what we are given right now, given all the drawbacks of basically using Bluetooth. And it's also a little bit of a novelty for public health officials because they're not used to this kind of a system. They're excited about it. We have been on calls with California, Washington, Houston, Pennsylvania, a variety of different states. And it's very clear that the public health officials are interested and they want to do something with Google and Apple APIs. But it's a novel thing. And one of the big things with public health and Department of Health is how does it actually interface? How does all these things interface with their backend service and their existing systems? And if you require a lot of training for their existing personnel, that's a pretty challenging task. That said, this particular app also supports that. And I think we basically had a lot of sleepless nights, and thanks to that, in mid-May, I think, the Washington state governor announced that they'll be working with us along with the Department of Health and Google and Apple to see if this is an app which, this approach is something which would help with the manual contact tracing efforts as well as proximity detection. It's not, and to this end, we have an ongoing study at UW, which is actually led by Landon over here and my close collaborator, Jake Sunshine, and a variety of different public health officials and epidemiologists. And the goal here is to basically, we don't want to, I mean, I'm lucky, Landon and I are lucky that we're living in a state which is very much science driven. We are still in the lockdown. We haven't opened up anything, unlike other states. So we are basically creating evidence to see if this particular approach is going to be useful. So there are pilots being designed right now to do this. There's also planned studies, which I think Landon is in talks with at Princeton as well as UC Berkeley. And one new update was that last week, so far as you know, all this work has been done by hundreds of hours of volunteer work from my student Justin, and more importantly, a lot of volunteers at Microsoft. And it's all volunteer work. So as we are moving towards actually supporting this, if evidence actually exists, we need a full-time team doing this. And last week, after an enormous amount of effort by our collaborator at Microsoft, Microsoft Service Teams has a go-ahead from the leadership to engage with customers if they want to customize and integrate and deploy this specific app, which is good because if your state or if your university or if your company wants to have some kind of a system which has a support, this could be a good option. And the last thing, now it's no longer in our hands because it's now in the hands of Washington State and the Department of Health and UW itself, because that's a service which UW is providing. So lawyers are involved. They changed the name. So now it's going to be called Common Circle. As of early this week, they changed the name because of trademark issues and so on. With that, I'm going to conclude, and I think I'm looking forward to what Dinesh has to say to improve the localization ability of Bluetooth.
All right, let me get started. Thank you, Shyam, for a great talk. I think this was really, really good to hear that so many people are excited and they are essentially trying to deploy it, right? I'm going to present a little bit more view of how we can do this in an automated fashion, right? And this is an effort we have been doing for past couple of months with a lot of my students and a lot of UCSD community, right? I think we have many volunteers contributing, but here are the 4 people who are contributing the most to this app, right? Or rather, API or app, as you like to call it, right? So basically, I'll get into what space and time distancing means here, right? Okay, but let's get started, right? So I think probably, as Landon has said, everybody knows, right? I think COVID-19 and how you track, right, really is a big problem for everyone, right? I think, and then what I want to add very specific points is that it's a very much context dependent, right? I think if you are running, this distance can become 15 feet instead of 6 feet, right? And then how do you trace such contacts, right? And there is a lot of studies from Oxford and other places to see and understand this better, right? How this propagate. And there is a study from Aalto University showing the simulation of how particulates spread, right? If somebody coughs, right? And essentially, we need to enable a way of doing some of social distancing and essentially doing some non-contact interactions, right? And tracking those, okay? So just to give an example, right? I think this is probably what, if you start going out, right? I think the first question is that, hey, if I'm getting too close to this, am I likely to contract COVID-19? So our first goal is really here is to track all these proximities, right? And while being privacy preserving, right? And then kind of enable a way to work in a way that it provides you this information and in the background collects all this information and keeps the track of this information and the social interactions, right? But not only that, I think if you go to hospital and other public use cases, right? I think I'll show you a quick video here, right? And this is probably, we are working with
A patient enters the hospital.
So
Google localizes the sick patient and starts forming a heat map. Nurse in vicinity is notified of a potential risk.
So just to give an example, this is probably like a little bit too privacy invasive, but I think an example what we are trying to show is that hospitals and supermarkets are also in need of solutions where they need and to know exactly when and what spaces have been touched, right? Or are providing some real-time alerts for this, right? And this is something we have recently working on IRB, and more or less we have the IRB close to done for this particular case as well. But going forward, sorry. So there are apps out there, right? A lot of apps out there, right? I think, and including what Shyam just presented, I still have it as COVID safe. I'll change it to community circle next time, Shyam. But basically, I think there is a unique opportunity for us as a community on working on smartphones and wireless algorithms, localization algorithms, to do wireless proximity, right? And let me maybe more crisply define this problem, right? And what our Google's goal is really probably to provide our APIs so that every one of these platforms can use them, right? In specific, we are really talking very closely with Arogya Setu right now in India. So they have a very interesting data set where they have labels of people who have acquired COVID-19, and they are right now trying to understand how to choose just an adaptive threshold for RSSI-based Bluetooth signals, right? And then this is something we are right now helping or working towards to help with them, help on them with this, right? So let me explain. This is what I want to make. In this COVID tracking, right, space and time both matter, right? Let me give you an example, concrete examples, what I mean by that, okay? So, sorry for this. So here example that there is like person A, B, and C, right? They are in supermarket, right? And let's say this is the setting, right, of distances between them, right? A and B are more likely to have contracted COVID if there was an interaction here between them, right? But in contrast, A and C and B and C are probably not coming in for social contact, right? But however, if you start using BLE, right, and then without doing a lot more context-driven, placement-driven, smartphone placement-driven, and all those issues into account, right, what you will end up having is a graph where you show that A, B, and C have come in a contact, right? But that's not true, really, right? What really has happened is that only A and B have a more likelihood of coming in contact, right? But A and C and B and C really probably very little, right? I think, and this is probably also depends, these experiments when we did, right, also depends a lot on how your phones are placed, right? Are they in your bag? Are they in your pockets? Are they in your, are you talking on them, right? And each of these things will create a different variation of contact graph, right? And so Bluebell's really the goal, and this is what we call as social distancing, right, is to do context-driven social distancing, okay, to figure out this context and essentially use that to build these graphs better, okay. Finally, the second example of temporal distancing is following, right? Imagine, let's say at 12 noon, right, okay, person who is blue, right, goes to the same aisle, right, and 15 minutes later, person B goes to the same aisle, and maybe 30 minutes later, person C goes to the same aisle, right? So really what you also want to construct here is basically construct a time graph, okay? So A and B would have more likelihood if, let's say, A had coughed when he went to aisle, right? He would have very high likelihood of spreading. This is what I call as surface touch, right? They might have interacted with same objects here again, right? And then again, this is not a holistic view, right? By just saying that if A and B went to the same location, doesn't mean that they have interacted with the same surfaces, right? So there is a whole host of problems beyond just trying to find a social or temporal social distancing here, right? And maybe not able to solve the entire host of problems, but I think we can at least give at a high level what is the likelihood of these things, these interactions happening, right? And truly the challenges here are to establishing, it's not about getting accurate localization, it's about making maybe the same error for A, B, and C and saying that they are at the same aisle, right? So really you want to establish uniqueness of a location, but in a privacy preserving manner, right? And these are the two fronts Bluebell is trying to attack and then, or essentially develop solutions for, okay? So let me just summarize this with this slide, right? Okay. So existing developments, I meant a lot of thresholding based techniques, and there might be a lot of other solutions which probably have improved recently. But really what we want to go to is a graph where we can provide this graph to any health. For example, in our case, we are working with UCSD Health and Earth 2.0, where we are providing these graphs to them, and they essentially can use these graphs in a way to develop risk scores, and they are building on algorithms which can do risk scores, right? So let me summarize some of the things which we kind of have got working here, right? So we, I think, built a crowdsourced data platform, right? And we have collected data from UCSD community, and we got thousands of data points. And I think each one has in itself like a few minutes of traces where people are doing different things, right? Okay. And then we also have built algorithms on top of this, right? And to do space social distancing, right? And we have achieved very accurate result. And surprisingly, what we are doing is we are trying to encode the context information as well into this algorithms, right? What we really require is a user to collect a small amount of data in their environment or in maybe one or two environments, right? And give us that data, right? And that data essentially helps us train a generalized model to make a specialized model fit to a particular person and the way they use their phones and their placements and so on and so forth, right? And it also figures out all the context, whether it's placed in phone, in your pocket or in your bag or in your hand, right? Furthermore, right now, this is the phase where we are in. We are trying to do time social distancing, right? Okay, and this is where we require some localization of hotspots, right? And that's what I mean by localization of hotspot, right? And this is where we are right now working on, right? And then finally, we want to integrate all of this into a personalized risk score for every user to know what their personalized risk score is. If their risk score is too high, right, they probably want to go talk to a health provider. And also if they are facing symptoms, right, probably want to interact with the apps they have, right, to see what as a next step should there for them be, right? So really that's our goal, right? And let me maybe quickly jump into the result. Instead, I don't have time to go to the detailed algorithm, but let me jump to the result, right? And this is maybe showing you the data is very highly varied and 4 different contexts, right? And orange here represents outside 6 feet and blue represents inside 6 feet, right? And then also this is context dependent, right? Sometimes it's 15 feet versus if you look at the 4th bottom right, it essentially really requires a whole lot of data collection and whatnot, right? So what we have achieved, right, is following. Let me explain. So this is our performance. The orange one here, first of all, this is a slightly atypical graph. And what we realize is this more intuitive way of thinking, right? It's a complementary CDF where it shows on x-axis classification accuracies, right? What we are saying is that 50% of the time, right, we are more than 75% accurate, okay? Or here, like somewhere around 78% accurate, right? And this is for a generalized model across all user by taking into account the contextual information and so on and so forth, right? And the contextual information is coming through IMU data and combined with the PLE RSS time series and so on. It's a slightly like a maybe 20-minute talk, but just to precise to say that this is a generalized model, right? Now, what we did is for one particular user, we made a customized model for his phone, right? Or well, here in this case, we did it for like 20 users, and this is all of our lab, right? And we showed that in those cases, we see 95% accuracy, more than 50, and this is, and almost always 90% more accurate in the prediction of the distances between space and time. Sorry, not time, but just space, right? So I think what really we are realizing is that training a customized model, right, okay, by small amount of data from each user, right, is a way to go forward. Right? And then I think we'll label a lot more accuracies, right? I think a natural question here comes to mind is that why do we need such high accuracy, right? I think turns out because the number of deployment and the number of users who plan to have this app, right, okay, is very limited. Like a lot of people don't have phones, a lot of people don't just have or not willing to do it, right? In either cases, right, this requires the accuracy to be super high so that even with a lower penetration, we can overcome those issues here, okay? So here is some initial results on our temporal social distancing. This is with a hospital use case. We deployed like BLE tiles, right? And we essentially have a user. So here the robot goes around and does a whole lot of data collection. And this is based on our recent work, DLOC, right? Which is going to appear. But you can see that robot is what you can probably use to get a lot of data if you are willing to contribute to our data set, right? And this allows us to like really identify hot zones, right? And I can show you 4 segregation in a high dimensional space right now. 1 or 2 feature just to show you that there is a good amount of information to separate them out here, okay? So please feel free to contribute, to join us, like, or if you want to do some experiments, you can just go to our website and it has detailed experiments on how to do the crowdsourced data collection. Please do it. It's totally privacy preserving and you will get some app developments in the future, right? Where you can get a specialized model delivered to your phone for yourself, okay? Sorry, I'm gonna not play the video, but I think I'm just gonna leave with this one last slide, okay? I think it's not just about doing BLE-based contact tracing. I think we need to think slightly more widely, right? We need to think about using phones as our become human, right? And essentially using audio, wireless, all the other sensing capabilities to form a coherent sensing module, right? Which can sense what a human could have sensed, for example, right? I think essentially like what Shyam said, right? I think contact tracing to become super accurate needs some human intervention at some point, right? We really want our phones to become that or to rise to that level, right? And it's a unique opportunity for entire MobiSys community to contribute to this now. I think with that, I'll just stop there. Sorry, I went a little bit over time, 3 minutes there. Sorry for that, Landon.
No worries. Thank you, Dinesh. Daniel, you have the screen.
Yes, I am.
I just want to say while Daniel was loading his slides, keep asking questions. Those are great starting points for the conversation we're going to have afterwards. So go ahead, Daniel.
Okay. All right. Can you see my screen? All right. So thank you, Dinesh and Shyam, for your talks. I think the contract tracing is a really interesting application, and it's really nice to see the research community mobilizing to address this pandemic. So as Landon mentioned, my name is Daniel. I'm a postdoc at the University of Toronto, a postgraduate researcher at the Vector Institute, and founder and CEO of Tabiat Research. So today I'll be talking about COVID-free at home, which is our solution for monitoring symptoms for COVID-19 patients who are recovering at home. And as with all works, this isn't an individual effort. It's a team project. So there's many different people involved on our team, and this project would be nowhere near where it is without all their dedicated time and effort. So I won't go too much into the background of COVID-19 because I'm sure you already know. Instead, I'll focus on the specific setting and the problem that we're dealing with. So we're interested in, let's say, a person who's starting to develop symptoms, or maybe they've come in contact with somebody with COVID-19. So they decide to go to a hospital and get tested. Now, their symptoms aren't severe enough that they require immediate hospitalization. So the medical professionals ask them to return home and self-isolate. Now their test results come back, and now they're COVID-19 positive. So now some of the patients in this setting, well, most of these patients will recover. However, some will deteriorate. So now in this setting, there's 4 specific problems that we're trying to address. The first is, now that there's this physical distance between the hospital and the patients that the hospital is providing care for, how can patients communicate with their doctors? So how can they provide their symptoms to the doctors? There's currently solutions that have been implemented like virtual visits, so something like a Zoom call with your doctor. However, that's very intermittent, and patients need to be able to recall how their symptoms were over the past week or so and then tell them at that time. So it's not an ideal solution. The other side of that is, how can doctors provide care for the many patients who are under their care? So these virtual visits are really nice and useful, but they're difficult to scale up. Another thing is patients who have tested positive and are now recovering at home are understandably very worried about their health. So they may be tempted when they develop new symptoms to return to hospital. So this is not only a risk for the patients because they're visiting a potentially infected area, but it also ties up healthcare resources on that patient. So how can we reassure patients who are recovering that they're actually recovering and don't necessarily need to return to hospital? And then finally, how can we identify patients who are deteriorating so that they can be brought to hospital early and provided the care that they actually need? So our idea, and the reason this talk is at MobiSys, is to use mobile technology to monitor patients with COVID-19 who are recovering at home. By mobile technology, I mean devices like smartwatches, which contain many different sensors that can be used to passively monitor patients, smartphones, which are an interface to the patients, and then a backend and dashboard that can be used by the clinicians to view the data. So let's take a look at the process in this setting now. So this patient has been tested positive, they're self-isolating at home. So what happens next is a care provider or a research coordinator reaches out to them for a follow-up call. During this call, they will ask them to install our mobile application and go over the consent form with them. And at some point, they will mail them any of the devices that they need. So this will be an oximeter, a thermometer, and eventually a smartwatch as well. The patient installs the mobile application on their phone, and then they begin to report their symptoms, their sensor data, and any concerns that they are non-urgent concerns they have about their health. And back on the medical side, the clinician is monitoring the data that's coming in and potentially providing any feedback that is needed. So now let's take a look at the mobile application we've developed. So it's called COVID Free at Home, and when patients install it, they're asked to enter in an access code. This is a way of making sure that only people who are enrolled in the study are actually using the application. Once they enter in their access code, they're presented with the same consent form that they were that they went over in the phone call. And once they've read it and understood everything, they can agree to participate in the study. Then, whenever they launch the application, they'll be presented with this symptom reporting screen. So it contains a list of symptoms that they've been experiencing. This list is pre-populated with the most common symptoms, but if you see the plus button in the bottom right, they can add other symptoms as well. So that contains a very long list of symptoms. Now for each symptom, they can indicate whether they've been experiencing it and indicate their progression of the symptom, whether it's new, worse, the same, or better than before. And for certain symptoms, they can attach additional pieces of information. So for shortness of breath, we have a dyspnea scale down at the bottom, which is a validated measure from the literature. Once they submit this, they're taken to a measurements page where they can use that oximeter and thermometer to report their oxygen saturation, heart rate, and temperature. And then this data, once they submit, is all uploaded to to our dashboard. The dashboard is used by the clinicians. And when the clinician logs in, what they see is a list of all the patients who are under their care. And this is sorted, prioritized, and highlighted based on certain metrics. So in this case, two patients are highlighted because their oxygen saturation was below 90. So understanding some of these thresholds and understanding which pieces of information are important required a lot of input from the clinical team. And even some things that we didn't know about. So for example, if you notice we have day number here, that's the number of days since the onset of the first symptom. And this is because the medical professionals know that between days 7 and 10 is when patients are most likely to deteriorate. So being able to know who's in that critical window and what sensor data or symptoms are associated with that window is a really useful thing for them. Now, the clinician can select one or more profiles from here, and when they click that check selected patients button, they'll be taken to a profile view of each individual patient. So this contains a lot of information. The first is contact information and ways of identifying who this patient is within their own electronic health record system. They also see a detailed history of all the measurements and symptoms that that patient has reported, aligned by time. So for any given time, what's the patient's oxygen saturation and symptoms that they're experiencing. They can also send messages to the patient. So this could be things like feedback it could be feedback, it looks like you're doing well. It could ask them, hey, looks like your oxygen saturation is a bit low. Could you monitor 4 times a day instead of 2 times a day? And at the bottom, it's not shown here, but there's also a list of all the messages that were received from the patient. And then finally, as part of the reassurance aspect of this, we have a done button on the top right, which the clinicians click whenever they've reviewed a profile. And this actually sends a message to the patient, letting them know that a doctor has just reviewed their profile and things look fine, or they'll be followed up if necessary. Now, this is what we have implemented so far, and this is something that we can probably go live with very soon. We have ethics approval and approval from the hospitals that we're working with as well. So, but some of the next steps for this project is to integrate that continuous sensing aspect. So we already have symptoms that we're getting from the patients that's being fed into the dashboard. Next, we want to start using things like a smartwatch and record continuous sensor data. So this sensor data is a much more objective view of the patient's health compared to the subjective response self-reported symptoms. And the idea is we can track these sensor data over time and extract useful signals, such as the patient's respiratory rate, their physical activity, their coughing, their speech patterns, and their heart rate, and then feed that into the dashboard as well. And some of these we already have implemented. So respiratory rate was a paper called Weird Breathing, which we presented in UBConf last year. We also have other models that we have working, like cough detection and some speech patterns, but those aren't published yet. And another next step for this project is to actually build a prediction model. So we have their self-reported symptoms, and maybe we'll have signals that are incorporated into the model as well. But either one of these data could be fed into to build a predictive model, which will help us figure out, will a patient recover or will they deteriorate? And this can be incorporated into both the reassurance aspect of it, so use the model to try and reassure patients that they are on the road to recovery. It can also be used to help identify which patients need to be brought back to the hospital. And having this model also improves the scalability of our approach, because if this model is in the loop and helping filter through patients, fewer physicians can provide care for a lot more patients. So some of the lessons we've learned so far and some tips. So understanding the process that's in place at health institutions and designing whatever system you're building to sort of support that process. That's really critical for these types of applications. Some of the challenges are that the process is different at each institution, and the processes even within institutions are rapidly changing because COVID is rapidly changing. So this leads to the second point, which is that a strong collaboration with both clinical researchers and the practitioners who are providing care for patients is essential. These are the people who will actually be using the system, and unless it's designed to facilitate whatever they're doing, it's not going to be used. And we came across lots of hurdles as well. So for example, Google and Apple both have strict requirements on who can publish COVID-related applications. So this process can potentially take weeks. Similarly, you have to go through security and privacy reviews at each of the institutions you're working with. So it's best to start these processes early and know who your sort of contact people are for these tasks. And with that, I thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions during the panel session.
Great, thank you, Daniel. Okay, so I think now we're going to open things up for questions. So thank you for everybody who's posted a question through Q&A. The one question, so there are a bunch. I think the one I'm going to start with is I'm going to direct it towards. There were several questions about the 15 minutes and 30 minutes of overlap between people in the same space, and sort of how you arrived at those values, and how much of a threat of transmission there really is if two people sort of passing through the same space, but never actually sharing it at the same time, if that makes sense.
Yes. I think there is a study on this from particular researchers from Aalto University, right? I couldn't point, I'll find the link, but basically what they show is that if you breathe or even when you cough, right? Let's say if you cough, that I think is another detriment, right? But breathe, cough, right? Their particulates are in air, right? And they slowly dilute, right? And then the rate at which they dilute, right? It depends, it essentially decides when somebody else who comes in the same vicinity, right? And they don't call this one airborne, but there is a very specific term to it. They call it second order airborne. I forget what it's called exactly, the word, but that's how this transmission could take place, right? And then that's where that study was trying to show what the time durations are, right? And I think, again, the whole goal is to kind of measure the time. How it should be used can be kind of like determined based on a little bit more input from infectious and disease and some of the other community who are working on this front, right? I think that's how probably I see this as such. And that's probably, hopefully that answers the question.
Great. Unfortunately, we don't have follow-up questions, so I'll assume that you gave a satisfactory answer. So there have been a couple of questions kind of in the comments asking about how these new technologies interact with existing medical procedures. And this kind of leads to a broader question in my mind, which is, when you first began working on these problems, you probably had some idea of what the technology would be like. But then when you started to either interact with real doctors, real healthcare systems, or read papers on our evolving understanding of the virus, what were the sort of biggest surprises in how you had to adjust your approach to solving certain problems, or were there certain constraints that you did not anticipate that you just could not ignore when you started to either engage with real doctors, real healthcare systems? Daniel, do you want to go first? I'll put you on the spot.
Sure. So there were a couple of things that were that took quite a bit of time to kind of work through, and we're still in the process of working through some of them. And that is what I talked about last, which is understanding the process that they have in place already. So in the past, we've done projects in hospitals as well, but that was much easier to deal with because we can sort of define our own process. But each health institution at this point has their own very focused response to how they deal with COVID-19. So understanding what process they have and how they're developing that process. So for example, who is interacting with patients? When do they interact? Are patients sent home before being tested, after getting their test results, or before getting their test results? And then what the follow-up process with patients look like. So understanding that has been something we had to work really closely with the clinicians for. And then even just minor things, right? In the past, we've been able to interact with patients so we can actually hand them a device. We can't do that anymore, so we had to figure out a lot more of the logistics of how do we set up and mail out devices to people.
Yeah. Shyam, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think people, as tech people, there is this attitude of like we can solve every problem in the world. It's not really the case at all in COVID-19. We're talking about public. This is not a technology problem at all. Like we are all trying to basically help them. It's not a technology problem. It's just the fact that you can't just create an app, because if you look at California, for example, how the response is actually, it's not going to be something where you can just give your doctor an app. It has to be happening. There's a whole public health infrastructure in this country in particular. I'm focusing on the United States because I know a lot more about that than Europe. Every state is completely different. Washington, for example, they had emergency laws to basically make it a little bit more centralized. But California, it's county by county. And there is no single backend system either, which basically works across all these different counties. So trying to design a system in the vacuum without understanding these constraints of what we are working with, I think is not a good approach. We need to actually understand what their actual problems are. Yeah, I think I would probably stop there.
Dinesh, what about you? Has your thinking about these problems evolved over time?
Significantly. Actually, I think when I started with this, right, I think the biggest thing I wouldn't forethought that would be a problem is getting it deployed and being used by people, right? That was, I thought, would be, given this is such a grave problem, right? I think everybody would be very, very willing to kind of get it deployed. I think the biggest issues and challenges which I have faced is not the technical one, but more of the getting people on board and convincing them and getting hospitals in like, okay, hey, let's do it, right? I think, and getting this mass deployed, I think probably has been a larger problem from where I stand. I probably think the same would be the case for Shyam or Daniyal here. And I just want to make this point. I think it's less technology, more of bureaucracy, but I guess I don't think we can solve that problem here, right? That's something I want to maybe make a big. If you are trying to get into this and think about how to do this, I think it'll be probably one thing which I learned is that I should have started right off the back with a few people who are already looking into this, and I think talk to medical schools and whatnot, and start from there, right?
So Dinesh, what sort of what sorts of skepticism do you hear? Like when you go to speak with
We probably lost our moderator.
I think, yeah. Oops. I kind of got the question probably, but yeah, I think we can just wait a second.
Sorry. Yeah, let me repeat my. What sort of skepticism are you getting when you speak to doctors and hospitals?
So I think when we talk to doctors, they are super excited and happy about this, right? And then there would be somebody who would be reviewing and then coming into the context from, okay, any case, I'll keep answering the question. From the context of who is looking into security, privacy, and one of them would be probably lawyer, right? Okay, they would come into the call and the discussion, and then it will get derailed into different directions, and then you'll have to bring it back. And I think that's kind of what I have faced as a major challenge, and then like making everyone, okay, yeah, this is good, like we should do it, right? So I think by far, let me tell you one thing which has been the most successful for me is I think like talking to Arogya Setu people has been the most successful thing for me, at least. And they have been nice and good about the discussion, and it's been a very less bureaucracy there. But at the same time, I'm not saying that the bureaucracy is bad. I think I'm just giving you an example, right? Let me give you an example, which I keep thinking. And so when we have to use Google Maps and maybe other services, right, we end up sharing our location with Google, right? But at the same time, when it comes to our own health, right, I think we are like thinking 100 different issues about it, right? As to, hey, should we share our location with these guys, right? Or should we not, right? I think I'm slightly puzzled with that response, right? That, or with that, I was puzzled, right? Now more puzzled. Now I think it's internalized rather. But that's something I've been like, how, I guess probably we didn't take into account the human behavior, right? Rather here. And then that was something was slightly surprising and shocking. I thought I just all the time use Google location services, right? I think they know me where I am, where at least, right? And I trust them, right? And but when it came to pandemic, right, we lost our trust, right? I think again, not to condemn, but probably Shyam and Daniyal can comment more on this as well.
So I actually would not say that we completely lost our trust. I think we should.
I'm not saying that.
There is a difference between like media writing articles to get clicks about like how everyone is terrible and all the tech companies are terrible. They have to be put on, they need to have their feet on the fire for sure, but I think we should basically not be completely swayed by the media articles and stuff. I think the bigger question here is the efficacy of the technology. Evidence is not there. Evidence collection takes time. It's not a thing where you can just deploy things where you can say it's going to fix the problem. That's not a thing. You need to basically, there are multiple parties here. You need to basically integrate with like public health. How does the system work? There's a whole system here, and this takes time. It's not a thing you can just click, and it's not a chat button. So I don't think it's actually a question of users are willing to use it, and public health agencies, in my opinion, of our interactions, are actually willing to use it. If there was a study of some kind, and if there was actually like real efficacy shown that this actually is going to help their processes. I mean, a lot of public health officials are willing to basically put money into basically like trying to even advertise these apps, but there is no evidence yet. So trying to I think that we're not there at a point of even talking about users. There's still no evidence of whether this will actually work. And we are now at an evidence collection phase. Maybe Landon can talk a little bit about the work he's doing on creating this evidence.
So, yeah, good, Landon. I think we can hear.
Do you want to add?
Should I add?
Sorry.
I cut off for a second.
Sorry, I think something, yeah, I'm going to turn off my video. But Daniel, did you want to add to the conversation before we talk about data collection and pilot studies and stuff like that?
Sure. Yeah, so I think some of the points are really valid. They're really true for our project as well. Dealing with all the different stakeholders, the lawyers, the security, the privacy, the REB, that's been basically my role for this project. And it's kind of surprising coming as a grad student doing development, and now like 95% of my time is coordinating with all the different stakeholders in the project, not coding. That's been a transition. And I also agree that it is absolutely about the people and the processes, at least for us, it's not so much about the technology yet. So we've had to really balance, this is a sort of an emergency. We need to launch something as soon as possible. So how can we use the technology that we already have to provide support for people immediately? But also how can we add some of the research and evidence collection aspects of it as well, so that we can progress things down the line as well.
Yeah, well, thank you. So yeah, so to follow up on what Shyam was saying, and sort of what Daniyal was saying too, which is we need to get things in place. There's a great amount of urgency to deploying these things, but we're doing it blind because we don't actually understand how effective these systems are. And that's a problem. You know, we're going to do a small pilot study in the coming weeks. But even then, the amount of data that we can collect is pretty limited. We still have to run on top of an API from Google and Apple that gives us very little information. And so we are going to try to probe the system in ways that reveals ground truth. But there's a tension in the design of Apple and Google's platform. I mean, their desire to preserve privacy by limiting access to information, and our desire to understand what's going on. As a user, you might have a desire to understand what's going on, and so the companies in charge of the platform have taken a very strict stance on privacy, that they want to have give apps and by extension users very limited information. So, you know, we're going to run a trial and other people will run trials and we will learn something. But I don't know if we'll be able to convince ourselves that it will be effective out in the wild. I think experience in other countries like Singapore and, you know, Australia and France has been pretty mixed with these Bluetooth approaches. And that might be because of low adoption or other reasons. But I think the question of whether exposure notifications using Bluetooth is really going to be effective is very open. And it's worth exploring. It's a new tool in public health's toolbox, but we aren't quite sure if it's going to be effective. And this actually leads me into a question I want to ask the rest of the panel. And I'll, you know, anybody who wants to answer should hop on. What do you have the most hope for? Which sort of piece of technology do you think in the end will be the most effective at containing the spread of the virus? It could be contact tracing, exposure notifications, it could be symptom diaries, it could be anything ranging from the most complex technical solution to the simplest. What do you think will be most effective?
I mean, I think the biggest thing is actually probably going to be just as simple as maths, honestly. Bluetooth-based proximity detection is only going to work if you have, I think, more than 50 to 70%, there was some numbers analysis which we did, adoption. Bluetooth-based things is not going to work in the wild. It might work in a university setup, or it could work in a corporation setup to try to do this for employees, assuming all the privacy constraints are taken care of. The other thing which could help is basically understanding what kind of a tech support you can provide to make the manual contact tracers job effective. For example, Washington is using a Microsoft system right now for their backend, or they started to use one in May, and to basically make their jobs a little bit more effective. I think those are the kind of, we can't really do this. We can't really solve this problem. It's more of trying to help people who are actually going to solve this problem.
I can maybe make a different comment. I think the way I see is there's no one technology which will probably help solve this problem, right? I think it will be, I had one slide towards the end, right? I think, and just to point that there will be, if we really want the technology to solve it has to rise to a level of like understanding human, it's essentially like building an AI, right? But the point I'm trying to make is that all sorts of input, right? Bluetooth, sound-based inputs, right? All the other technologies, coherent combining of such things would really make it really effective contact tracing, right? And probably would help overall the job of even the let's say, in-person contact tracing or manual contact tracing, right? And remind people of their past locations, right? Just interactions, right? And some unknown interactions, right, will be captured by these contact tracing, right? But really, the point is to look at the holistic point in with multiple different technologies and not looking at one specific technology to be able to solve this problem, right? And then Shyam can comment on sound-based. I think last time, if I remember, they cannot use sound for some privacy reasons. There's another question here, rather. But yeah, that's my at least take on this, at least.
I think it's more power consumption than privacy. If you're using because rather let me be more explicit about it. We don't know what the power consumption of ultrasound-based ranging approaches. We don't know, and people haven't invested a lot of time in it. I think the Bluetooth stuff has basically taken over all the airways, and it actually does bring to a question which probably was asked earlier, which is that what does the research community should be working on to help? One of the things which became really clear to me through this specific process was that we're not really solving the problems which can actually help, unfortunately. I mean, that could be a controversial statement to make, but we have had like almost more than a decade of work in localization. A lot of that, USRPs and software radios have been enormously helpful for us. But that's also made us like a lot more lax about what is actually going to be useful and what's available. There is no real Bluetooth localization approach which would give us that sub-meter resolution or anything which would deal with multipath. And someone who basically hasn't been in our community can come up with like a RSSI-based algorithm and tuning, which is going to be as good as we could have come up with, given the constraints of it. And in the conversations which we had with Google and Apple, it's actually very clear that they understand that Bluetooth-based localization with RSSI is pretty limited. And the only approach is basically going to an ultra new hardware in the future if we have new phones with ultra wideband. So if we want to really have impact with the work which has been happening in this work, in this community on localization, it has to basically work on actual smartphones. It has to work on actual devices without and assuming things which don't really drain the battery. And I think that's a really research opportunity which people should work on and try to build systems in localization which work on smartphones by using Bluetooth or Wi-Fi or acoustics or whatever, which address actual system level challenges and works across a variety of different smartphone platforms.
Daniel, what should we be working on? What do you think will be most effective?
I actually agree with Shyam and Dinesh. So it's not, I don't think the solution is technology. The technology is just going to assist the medical professionals who are actually working on the solution. So the solution is going to come from the medicine side of things and also from people just being cautious, right? So I think one of the benefits of some of these technologies like contact tracing is it actually raises awareness in people as well that they should be taking care about social distancing. Same with our symptom diaries of people being cognizant of their symptoms and trying to understand how they're progressing. There's a lot of human factors there as well. So the solutions are going to come from the human factors and then just time, I think.
Great. Okay, so it appears to be 5:30. So I think we'll just end now. So I want to thank all of the panelists, especially for doing this on such short notice. I really appreciate it. I apologize if we weren't able to get to some of the questions. I will go back through the questions and try to answer them online, since we were not able to answer all of them verbally. But thank you. I hope that this was
Landon, one comment before you.
Yeah, go ahead.
The questions would get disappeared once you terminate the session. So if you want to just keep the record, I don't know how to keep that record.
Don't worry, we are keeping track of them. Thank you.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Iqbal. Okay, so thanks to everybody. I hope you have a good afternoon or good evening. And I'll try to answer the questions as best I can. All right, take care, everybody.
Thank you, Landon. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Thank you.